I mean, in terms of the issues facing the African continent, I mean, there's so many issues facing the African continent. I mean, there's poverty, there's climate change, there's war. In some senses, you could say the issues facing the African continent are very similar to the issues facing many of the other continents, in fact. But for some reason, Africa is inordinately singled out for the representations in the popular media about these various issues. And I think when we talk about connecting struggles, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that there's an ideological element of dehumanization that goes into why certain people in certain places are portrayed in the way they are to stop people from asking questions. I mean, I think everyone on this panel, we could go on for a very long time about what are the connections between the struggles here in the United States or anywhere in the world and the struggles in Africa. I mean, you can boil it down. The same people who want Southeast DC to be poor are the same people who want Africa to be poor. And so it's not, really any. But so much of what is in many ways obvious in front of us is harder to see when it's, covered in the fog of propaganda and misinformation and disinformation. I mean, you think about even just some basic facts. This actually came up, interestingly enough, at the African Investment Forum in Abidjan a couple months ago, maybe a month ago. When you look at issues of credit ratings for countries, which has a huge role in development, right? Because countries want to put out bonds, they want to be able to raise money, they want to promote their own development. Your credit rating, just like for you and I, determines quite a bit about how expensive that loan is going to be. If you look at a country like Ghana, its debt to GDP ratio, which is one of the things that goes into these credit ratings, is well below, actually, Greece and Portugal. But if you look at the 2021 Moody's ratings of countries, Ghana is listed far below Greece or Portugal. So even though the finances of the first two countries are, in fact, not very sound at all, it is cheaper for them to put loans out and to have bonds and to seek ways to develop their own countries. And so you can see it's not really objective. But the perception of Africa as corrupt allows you to then put something like that in a Moody's book because no one's going to question it. No one's actually going to look at the analytics and say, well, why is it that Greece has such a higher 200% debt to GDP ratio, Ghana has 83%, and somehow it's considered safer to lend money to Greece than to Ghana? I mean, it's an interesting question to ask, but no one's going to question it because the perception of Africa is so skewed in the context of corruption. And on that point, by the way, Africa as a continent, compared to all the other continents, has the lowest default rate on major infrastructure projects. So the perception is if you invest in Africa, it's 100% corrupt, and if you invest in North America, it's not corrupt, but you're more likely to invest your money in a project that is going to be corrupt and poorly managed and fail in the United States than on the African continent, percentage-wise. But it's not heard that way. There's about 10 to 12 million people who speak Zulu, the isiZulu language in South Africa. But when you look at anything, and people who follow this, the Zulu king was just the new Zulu king, had his big celebration to be enthroned. And if you follow the international media, it's all about these tribal kings and these tribal Zulus. And it's funny to me the way that the phrase is used because it's designed to de-emphasize the reality of the Zulu people in South Africa. Because when you think tribe, you think small, you think insignificant, you think, not substantial, you think antiquated. But, it's notable, in my view, that there are more people who are both Zulu and speak Zulu than the number of people in Norway. But you would never hear anyone call Norwegians a tribe. And can you imagine when the king of Norway had his investiture, if they called him a tribal leader of Norway, no one would ever say that. And so anyway, I just say all this just to say that so many of the important elements of making the connections between any given struggle is not just the things that we all can say and the political education we all know we have to do, but it's also the innate curiosity of individuals to try to seek out the truth and to solve the problems in front of them and to see the conundrums. But if you're stopped at the very beginning from even asking the most relevant questions about what are the connections, especially diasporically, between Black communities in the United States and the African continent and the Caribbean and South America, if you're stopped at the very beginning, that's a huge, huge problem. So I wanted to just highlight that at the top, and I know we'll talk about it, but I do think that that's an important element of this conversation. And you can see it on so many levels. I mean, just a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C. at Freedom Plaza, the so-called foundational Black Americans had a rally about, I'm not sure, But the foundational Black Americans whose entire goal is to separate Black people born in the United States from Africans or those they perceive to be Africans and Caribbean descended peoples as somehow very, very different with a totally different set of interests and opportunities. And Pan-Africanism is antiquated. I don't want to get deep into the foundational Black Americans, but the thing that really blew me away is that the head of the movement is named Tariq Nasheed. And I'm just like, you up here with a Muslim name talking about there's no connection between Black people in America and Black people in Africa? Well, how would you even think you had a connection to the Muslim history if it wasn't for your own ancestors' history in West Africa? So it shows, again, the level of ideological confusion that stands in the way here. So when you look at the issues that are facing the African continent, and I'll move to close here, I think that it's already been said, and Yolian laid it out. I mean, these are not accidents, right? I mean, these are the deliberate policies of empire to keep certain countries poor so that other people can be rich. And in those countries, to lift up some subset of people who also will be rich, to ally with the small number of people who will also be rich in these Western countries. And they're all sort of colluding to make sure that this industry of poverty and destruction and deprivation continues for their own benefit. It's not just that they're evil people doing evil things. I'm sure many of them are. But even those who are well-meaning, by the very maintenance of the system that exists, they are continuing to perpetuate these things that are, in fact, deeply, deeply detrimental, not just to people in Africa, but also people in the United States. I think the idea that somehow the maybe limited material gains you may get by living in a wealthier country is somehow really benefiting you when the rest of the world is in poverty, I think is a deeply backward understanding that somehow we can be better off when most of the world is living terribly as opposed to living together and sustainably in harmony and looking to maximize our relationships between each other so everyone can live the best they can. I mean, it's sort of amazing. That's the latter thing is considered totally crazy and no one would ever do that, but it's supposed to be good to live in the United States when everyone else is living in a terrible way just because maybe it's easier to get an iPhone. But if getting an iPhone is the only way you measure wealth, measure well-being, that I think in and of itself is a problem, and that's a huge issue. And I think that's the issue that's facing the African continent, is that problems are defined vis-a-vis wealth, problems are defined vis-a-vis class, problems are defined vis-a-vis profit. They're not actually defined vis-a-vis the needs of people themselves and what they need to not just survive, but to be able to thrive. I think there's a lot of steps we can take and a lot that we'll hear and probably a lot we can do in the next week, just right here in Washington, D.C., that can start to bring in together and connect these struggles. But I think we have to connect very directly who are those who are responsible for these issues? And when we start to see who's responsible for the poverty in Africa, like I said, it's not going to be that confusing. It's the same people who are responsible for the poverty in Anacostia, Baltimore, Oakland, Chicago, Paris, France, and the outskirts there, Kinshasa. Everywhere you go, it's really the same people, and they all meet all the time. The World Economic Forum. It's not like they're hiding it. I mean, they're openly coming together on a regular basis to discuss their plans and what they want to do and who they are. And I think we can identify them and see them, and the connections will start to make themselves clear, on that basis. So I'll just say one final thing. Africa, 70% of the people there are under the age of 30. And anyone who's spent any time on the continent, you know exactly what I mean. It's actually very striking in every African country how young they are. And I think that is a huge factor in what we are seeing all across the continent right now, where people are rising up in many different ways. Certainly we're seeing it all across French-speaking Africa. And even some of the worst leaders, by my own opinion, you can see now, are talking about the fear of a social explosion. And I'm not making this direct connection, but I will say that the president of Niger said this just the other day, that unless they're able to exploit their oil industry more, that they're all going to be overthrown because people are going to rise up because they're tired of living in poverty. And if you think about something that is I think, a shared value between people here, you think about what happened in 2020 and the uprisings that have happened since 2014 and people in Africa, is that young people are looking at the future and they're refusing to live as their parents and their grandparents did in subservience and deprivation. People are looking at the future and saying it has to be different now, and if not now, then when? If not who, then us. And I think that's a powerful moment that we're in to be having an event like this, and I'm really just happy to be here and to be a part of it and to be here along with these excellent co-panelists. So thank you so much.